There's a delicate balance in writing dialogue. You need to imply a character's flaws, fears, aspirations, and needs without them outright saying them. Sometimes it's because the character simply doesn't have that information about themselves, or doesn't know it at least. And other times it's because it's scary to bear the dreams and terrors closest to your heart to this random main character you just met. And the last reason is, it kinda just takes away from the character's intrigue. So, with that said, why are some of the most memorable character moments the times when they are able to express these things? How do we do this without the monologue sounding like the character's just reading a Wikipedia article about themselves? For that, let's delve into the plot. As these scenes, when done most effectively, usually take place during a Darkest Hour or Resolution, the heaviest spoilers will be for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Arcane Season 1, Astarion's entire companion quest in Baldur's Gate 3, and some early spoilers for Persona 4. So then, let's begin. When you think of a scene where a character can finally say what's been plaguing them, is the first thing that comes to mind a good example of cathartic character development, or is it a cliched and unearned way that the writer is trying to get the audience to sympathize with the character? Like, genuinely, what comes to mind first, because there are scenes from both sides that I can think of with this question. But what actually separates these monologues that are done well versus poorly? When I say a "this is my flaw" scene, the type of dialogue I'm referencing is when the character monologues about either their internal conflict, fears, recognized character growth, or, and this one will be a shocker, their character flaws. You know, those scenes where two characters will be sitting in a darkened room after having temporarily escaped some grand threat and then decide that this is the perfect time to talk about their tragic backstory and how it still affects them. Narratively, this is a pretty good placement, though, as the story will have had time to establish the setups necessary for this emotional release, as well as the Darkest Hour being able to put these characters in a more emotionally vulnerable spot. But sometimes this doesn't take place during the Darkest Hour. Many instances of "this is my flaw" scenes are actually used as a resolution or reaction, allowing the character to recognize their growth and accept that they have overcome their internal conflict or main flaw. So, how do we write this? First, we'll need to look at what makes efficient, natural dialogue and subtext, and I think that the most important aspect here is going to be the character voice, the unique way that the character expresses themselves, which will impact how they phrase their "this is my flaw" scene. In writing dialogue, it's typically best to avoid lines like "I am sad" or "I don't like sand, it's coarse, rough, and irritating, just like this dialogue." Anything where a character outright says what's troubling them with no dialogue filters is gonna sound a little weird, but this can be fixed with a bit of perspective change to the wording. For an example of some wondrously cringe dialogue from none other than my 15-year-old self in a very early draft of the book that I'm still somehow working on 50 drafts later, here are a few lines from the Darkest Hour. "You could have run. What happened to the cowardice that might have saved you? And now, please, don't leave me alone. Not after I'd finally found you. Don't go." Oh, and we have this lovely, not at all cliche or forced, "I'm too weak to bear this emptiness a second time." Protagonist paused. "I've never been much of a believer in anything, but I hope you've found peace. And I say this with pain in my heart, but I hope you've reunited with character." Ugh, yikes. I spared you the majority of this monologue, but you know, despite these lines sounding like I cut apart better monologues and then spliced them together with expired glue, the problem does still ultimately lie in the character voice and contextualization, mostly. Some of these lines are just bad. Most of them, actually. For context, the speaking character is a thief who trusts no one apart from one or two people who have entirely earned it. He's a brat, he's mean, he doesn't like when people have hope because he thinks that hopes and wishes are only there to ultimately destroy a person when they don't come true. And he's saying these lines? Really? Sure, there's been some character development, but seriously. But how do we fix this? Well, the first thing that will have to go is the line, "Not after I finally found you," and a close second is, "I'm too weak to bear this emptiness a second time." Characters can certainly understand when they're sad or emotionally or morally weakened, but there isn't much to gain from outright saying it, unless the character is either at a very well-earned emotional breaking point or is trying to get pity. And this brings us to the topic of dialogue's focus. Because if a character saying their internal conflict needs or development aloud makes for poor writing, then what does that say about these three fantastic scenes?
"This mask is my badge, and I'm trying to be good too. I was trying so hard to wear this thing the way you would want, and I didn't. I can do all these things, but I can't help the people I love the most, and they can only know half of who I am, so
When my parents were still alive, me and Powder used to share a bed like this, except maybe half the size. We played a game where we pretended to be bigger and bigger monsters. Sometimes I'd get carried away and she'd get scared. I didn't want her to start crying and wake my parents up, so I pretended to chase my own monsters away. I'd say, no monster's gonna get you when I'm here. Then a real monster showed up, and I just ran away. I left her.
Nearly 200 years. And I never came back. Not since the night I woke up down there. There's almost nothing left of the person I was. Just a name on a rock. Now I need to figure out who I am. What I want. I feel safe with you. Seen. And whatever the future holds for me, I don't want to lose that. I've been dead in the ground for long enough. It's time to try living again.
These are amazing scenes with masterful dialogue, and yet these lines still involve characters saying things like, I feel blank, and essentially explaining their internal conflicts, guilt, or character development. So what truly differentiates these scenes from something like Persona 4's shadow confrontations, where each character faces the manifestation of the part of themselves that they hide from the world?
You put on a good show of being carefree and happy-go-lucky because you're so terrified of being alone. The more the merrier, right? You've got to be surrounded by people to block out the pain of isolation.
Well, a lot, as it turns out. First, despite how clearly these good monologue scenes describe each character's conflict and mentality, there's a poetic nature to how it's worded. With the Arcane example, Vi was able to tie her guilt into a story about the game she and Powder would play as kids, then later likening Silco, and maybe even herself or Jinx, to the monster that she couldn't protect Powder from during the actual heart of the scene. And this scene introduction is a fantastic way to make a character feel more comfortable with opening up and speaking more vulnerably, assuming you're going for a quiet moment instead of a character realization or confession at the climax of an argument, which can be very fun in its own right. Writing this type of setup or segue into the monologue can be quite brief. For Vi, she noted how Caitlin's hyperfocus on figuring out the Jinx case reminded her of Powder's obsessions. This setup can also come about as a reaction scene after a major plot point or character decision, as seen with Unascended Astarian's graveyard scene. Since he's finally reclaimed freedom from Cazador, as well as surrendering essentially vampiric godhood in exchange for avoiding becoming the most insufferable little repeating and perpetuating Cazador's cruelty, he was able to truly reflect because it was an emotionally taxing event that he was finally able to process a bit more after it had happened. These setups are important because they ease the character, scene, and audience into the dialogue that would otherwise sound out of place if said under most other circumstances. All of the shadow encounters from Persona 4 suffer from a lack of this transition dialogue, alongside sounding like theatrical villain monologues most of the time, which makes the following dialogue feel jarring or unearned. But back to the previous point, is there any secret ingredient to distilling character flaws into dialogue that doesn't make the audience cringe? Once the setup is out of the way, two major factors in writing this monologue efficiently are the character's genuine feelings versus what they're focusing on in that scene. The way that each character contextualizes their flaws, fears, and understanding of themselves or the world will be different. The genuine core of Vi's scene is guilt, but she at no point says, I feel guilty for leaving Powder. Instead, this guilt is contextualized in her story about the game she and Powder used to play. For Gwen, she uses her mask as an analogy and segue into the heart of the scene. While her dialogue is a bit more blunt than Vi's, there's still something there that the character is focusing on, that being protection. She talks about her mask being a badge that she tried to wield to save the people that she cared about but failed to do so. And this whole badge metaphor was brought upon by her father being a police officer. Astarian's focus, while it is also largely on his character development, is brought upon by the fact that he's finally returned to his grave, where it all started for the first time since he initially lost his freedom. This theming around the grave is a perfect avenue for him to focus on how his old self is almost entirely dead and lost, meaning that he needs to start rediscovering who he is. It's this focus on something other than the internal conflict or mentality itself that allows the character to truly lament or wax poetic without seeming melodramatic. Back to Persona 4, I swear I actually do like this game. The fact that the shadows are the primary monologuers in these scenes prevents them from diverting the focus to anything else, leading to every shadow confrontation to play out quite similarly. And apart from the quick arc of, no, that's not true, you're not me, to, never mind, these are my flaws, it had the potential to be a very decent revelation arc, but ultimately ended up feeling a bit rushed. But it's easy enough to lay out these guidelines without truly being able to implement them, so how do you figure out what type of this is my flaw scene would work best for your story? First, understanding what the core of the scene is and how the core will impact the affected character. Is it guilt, isolation, or acceptance of positive growth, or honestly anything else? Distilling the scene into one major concept can help you write the theme and, more importantly, the physicalized contextualization of that theme. Next, how can you have the character say the scene's core without actually saying it? What is the character fixating on that parallels their conflict or realized growth? It doesn't have to be anything so allegorical as talking about how some green light is the unattainable American dream, but just enough of a parallel for the character to remember their lines so they don't start improvising cliches. Third, remember this is still an entire scene. There should be mood shift, setup, development, climax, resolution, and reaction, and should typically end in a different emotion than it started. So, and this part is more for me than any additional writing advice, but I'm gonna try rewriting that initial egregious monologue from earlier. This might get a bit rambly, but hey, that's kind of the point of this channel. First, obliterating what I used to think was well written. Alright, now that I've written this script, I definitely see the narrative issue with the "not after I finally found you," apart from how cliched it is. The dialogue's initial focus was somber irritation about why character B didn't try to run away like he would have done at the beginning of his arc. This scene initially took place on a battlefield right after the dust settled and everyone had taken a moment to realize character B's fate after he saved them from a not at all cliche heroic sacrifice with no other narrative purpose, I swear. First, I'd rewrite the timing. I'd have character A, the monologuer, not be able to handle the reality of what happened, instead opting to flee from the scene until he could regain a bit of composure and face character B's court, maybe with some smaller heart-to-heart with another character in between that leads him back to face what happened. Alternatively, character B could have still been on his last breaths after the fight, leading character A to run over and say something like, and this is a very first draft type of rewrite, so bear with me. "Why didn't you run? Answer me, damn it." You're alive, aren't you? We're not talking about that. What happened to the cowardice bastard who would have ditched us and lived? Character B's pulse flickered, his breath congealing in his throat. Character A hastened to listen for a heartbeat. Character B tried to speak, though only hoarse whispers could escape his throat. "Shut up and save your strength. Just give me more time." Character B, mustering his remaining breath, whispers an apology. "I said save your strength!" "Don't go." Character B's heartbeat fades. "Please, don't leave me alone." He paused, noting character B's unmoving stare. "I've never been much of a believer in anything, but I hope you find insert tragic backstory dead character's name here." It's definitely not perfect, and I don't know how many of you actually stuck around for that madness, but the revision at least sounds better, which isn't hard to achieve there. And with that, I'm gonna go start a second Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough and pretend that I don't have about 10 hours left of Persona 4 Golden. Happy writing! Bye!